As I said, I've been around the space for about 30 years. My work here is really around, I'm a passionate advocate for the NDIS, but not blind to its flaws. And I think it takes us about 80% of where we need to be, but it has this extraordinary focus on individuals. So for me, I think the bit that's missing in the puzzle is working with community. The reason I'm working with Castlemaine is because you're highly skilled, highly engaged, and deliver over a long period of time. So that's what's brought me up the road, really. So I'll launch into what I'm going to talk about today, which is to give you a framework about how I see housing. Just before I do, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners, past, present and emerging, which is very important. I actually come from a place called Balranald, New South Wales. I came from a community of 1,500 people. I have a niece who has an intellectual disability who lives in a house, a community-run housing project, and is supported and encouraged by the entire community. So in all my work, when I'm working away in the various projects around the country, it's always sitting in the back of my mind, how would this work for Katie and her community? And I think if you guys can make this work, this is a methodology other communities can take on.
Yes.
You have my contact details there. I have a website which I often post things on. A couple of years ago I got grumpy and just wrote down everything I knew about NDIS and housing in a book which I'll leave here for you. The bankers like it because it has simple concepts. The academics don't like it because there's not enough references. Okay.
Did anyone want a copy of the slides? I did bring a few extra copies.
I'd love a copy.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Stephen, would you like a? You good? Trent? You good? Yeah.
Thanks, Kerry.
Okay, and like every presentation around the NDIS, you've got to start with the beast itself. And as was mentioned before, this was the largest, or is the largest, social reform happening in the English-speaking world. And as I've tracked through it, I've struggled to engage with it because I'm used to doing program development, I'm used to doing policy, but I've never met a beast like this. So it is complicated even for us so-called experts. There's one analogy. There's a program, a housing program called NRAS that was run out, which is in some ways similar to the way the NDIS looks at funds housing. And when I compared the two of them, in a 4-year period, NRAS delivered about 13,000 properties. In the same 4-year period, the NDIS delivered 1,000. So you begin to see this really slow progression. So it's often why you run into people who are frustrated because it's taking so long. And so part of this story is this is a complicated beast. But where we are today, and I suppose it's worth thinking about, in terms of the Loddon region which we sit in today, that we will see more people getting services. So the projection was another 1,900 people getting services, and there is this projection of funding that goes from 130 to 300 million. Now in the metro, another 170 million is not significant, but once you move into regional areas, this takes on a whole economic development aspect, which is often missed. Because this is not just money and services for people, this is jobs and employment, and these are jobs people can get. They can be part-time, you don't need a master's degree to get them. So they become very important. We are at the very early stages, even though we're a number of years in, and we're still only spending 65% of the funds allocated. So that's a figure that I often track to see how effective we are. So that means that people don't have actually access to the services that they can buy. It's as simple as that. So this will happen over time, and it's the market development stuff that's going on that is incredibly important. I think it's worth thinking about where we are in regional areas, because when you look at what happens traditionally, metropolitan areas and, for example, the eastern suburbs of Melbourne get far more services than even the western suburbs of Melbourne or in regional areas. So there's this bias built in, and you can actually see it in some now of the data that the NDIS produced. So there's this traditional bias that regional areas miss out. But that is being weirdly compensated because we built these institutions in places like Ararat and others and then closed them down, and that meant we have this concentration in regional areas. So statistically you can look at an area and it could look as though it's actually sitting at the right level, but that could be because in one town it has all of this stuff around it, and the next town it's got nothing. And to a degree, Castlemaine is that next town that has nothing in a region that looks as though it's fairly well funded. So it's a bit deceptive.
This region had Sandhurst,
Yeah, so
but it's still going, isn't it? I think.
No, I think it's almost. No, I think it's gone now.
Okay.
They're very close.
So you're getting the funding from the NDI, what do they call it, state of play thing? that we're getting information?
These numbers,
Yeah.
they're coming out of the original market reports.
The NDIA do on a quarterly basis?
No, these are the original market reports they did back about 3 or 4 years ago.
Because we do one for DSS, which is based on postcode.
Well, you would have more up to date reports.
Yes, so we do current and forecast.
Okay, so how has it changed? What's changed? Has it gone up or down? Do you know?
Oh, look, I can't. No, on those. I don't know. I need to have a look.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways it doesn't matter in terms of the money is absolutely substantial increase. This is not a 5 or 10% increase.
No,
this is lots. And there are more people coming through. So they're the key messages. I think the thing about the structure of the NDIS is that it is individually based, which is quite different to our traditional model. And that's great, but there's no guarantee all the participants will get all they're entitled to. So this is very much, as I said, biased towards the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, biased towards English speaking and all those things. So you've really got to, I think there's a real challenge in regional areas to actually get what you're entitled to, let alone more. And the other thing that happens is that there's no guarantee the services will benefit more than just the individual, and I think that's very important. I think about Balranald and the NDIS people, they're using their funds to create a bus that goes to Swan Hill, because Swan Hills is the service centre, but suddenly what happens is you then have this bus service that the rest of the community can actually participate in and benefit from. So that becomes very important. That's not an objective of the NDIS, it's not a focus of theirs, but to a community, I think it's one of the reasons you engage with them, because it opens up other sorts of possibilities. I think the NDIS is now rolling out across Australia, so in every part of it, but it is very different in every state. I mean, there's an argument that says WA and Victoria have the most sophisticated disability service systems, but in fact WA was very late into the game. So, yeah, and New South Wales are very early. So if you look at the numbers, New South Wales is probably much further down the track. So it is patchy, while the NDIS is framed around a national market, to me it doesn't make a lot of sense. There's too much history at the state level, and then you look at actual markets. I mean, I think about a market as 100,000 people, 150,000 people. You don't really care what goes on in Geelong, but it's going to be around here. So I think communities are confronted with this absolute choice. They can wait for the NDIS to come along and deliver what that will be delivered, or they can act. And I'm a very strong advocate that they act. And it may be that it doesn't give you much difference, but I suspect it will fundamentally change the numbers of people that will probably not be enrolled, but actually get the services that make a real difference. But it also can actually allow you to create a much better service within your community if you use the NDIS as leverage. I mean, the NDIS in terms of employment would be the largest growth in this area. Would that be right? In terms of employment?
In Castlemaine, you mean?
Well, in the region. In terms of growth, not in terms of
in terms of growth, yeah.
Yeah, so it's the largest growth. It's probably the third or fourth biggest industry. The money went from being...
With aged care, I think.
Well, the money...
Health would be one of the biggest.
Yeah, so it tends to be retail, health and aged care. So in terms of dollar terms, the NDIS, spending on disability was about half of aged care, and I think this year it actually surpassed it. So what you see is this huge ramp up going on. So that's sort of the bigger picture. This is why this space is complicated. It is a big beast. In terms of housing, for all sorts of historical reasons, people with disabilities haven't sought housing because traditionally they haven't had access to support. So they come to us and say, we'll give you a house if you can provide us support for my child, essentially, usually a family member. And you can't, because at those days there was no support, or the support was locked to a particular property. The thing that the NDIS has done has broken that relationship. So there's all this pent-up demand that's now coming out there. It's why we're seeing people looking for housing that has never appeared before. It's because they can move, they've got portable and adequate support. Unfortunately, for all sorts of historical reasons, the NDIS will only fund 6% of it. So it funds the highest level of need, which is specialist disability accommodation, and it leaves the other 94 in a much less clear circumstance. So there is funding. It is recurrent, which is unusual. It's not capital, it's recurrent, and it's commercial in an open marketplace. So it's quite a different form of funding than we're used to, but it only covers a very small proportion. The thing that has changed in terms of those that miss out, what we call the other 94%, is there been an evolution of a number of funding programs which is now offering some hope. So we're beginning to see change even at a really fundamental level today. There's a program called, I always get this wrong, Individual Living Options, or it's ILO, anyway. A program called ILO that's rolling out, which is now being used in quite flexible ways that 6 or 12 months ago it wasn't. So that will help people access the private rental market potentially. So it is possible, it's just different things are happening in different segments. But when you're thinking about housing and the NDIS, it's useful to think about SDA, specialist disability accommodation, and the rest, because they are quite separate. So, if we think about the housing journey, so people are living somewhere and they want to go somewhere and they can go somewhere now. So these are NDIS participants. I think of it in 4 phases. I sort of break it up into a process. This is going to look very complicated, but what I'll do at the end, in about 3 or 4 slides' time, is take you through an individual journey. So in some ways, while this looks complicated, it's not complicated from an individual's point of view, because they come to a number of barriers and choices and they go down a single track. So there's 4 different phases, where they're living existing, planning, transition and new housing. So people typically will live, the vast majority of people will live in existing group homes, which you actually, in this community, have none, which is very unusual. They'll be living at home, which is where the vast majority of people do, or they'll be living in aged care. So this is the young people in residential aged care initiative that the government's committed to. So that's where I expect to see 90-95% of NDIS participants. Then they'll go through a planning process, so they get assessed and they may have SDA put in their plan, or they may have another form of housing put in their plan, and they may have a support coordinator appointed to assist in that process. So that's sort of that next step. One of the things that is really just emerging now is this sense of transition. So people want to immediately move from the old housing to the new housing. They may move through medium-term accommodation or short-term accommodation. These are fairly new programs. Short-term accommodation was what we used to call Respite back in the day. But medium-term accommodation is this beast that's becoming very useful, but it's quite ill-deformed, but very useful, because it can allow you to bridge to other options that may be 12 or 18 months away. The best example I can think of is if there's new property being built, you can actually be living in medium-term accommodation for 12 or 18 months until it actually gets built. That makes perfect sense.
And in fact, if I can just add a little bit in here, Joseph, the Respite house has got a part at the back of it which is actually set up for this same sort of living. It was there for people who weren't wanting to transition into longer-term accommodation, and it gives them an opportunity to practice. They can't be there, full on, because it's only for 1 bedroom, but it would normally be a shared care sort of arrangement, so they may be with parents for a couple of days a week and living in this for 3 or 4 days and learning skills so that they can then be prepared for their longer term objective.
And if you think about it, if somebody's been living in the family home for 30 or 40 years, which is not uncommon with some of the people living in the community, it's reasonable to think about a transition time to learn a whole bunch of skills to actually move out of home. I mean, dare I say, there'd be some children that would need to learn a whole bunch of skills to move out of home, whether they have a disability or not. So the other part of the story, which we often don't talk about, is the need for the family, time for the family to adjust. Because it is a huge thing. It's not the relationship with a child living at home with a disability is much different. It requires much more trust for the family to allow the child to move out and have that confidence. So we need to accommodate time and processes for both of those transitions to happen if it's going to be successful.
And when we did our research, that came out very strongly. The families not really feeling how we're going to mitigate against the safety issues for their child. What would we have to put in place? So they were very, very important issues for the family members.
And then the question is, where do they go? And I break it down into two types of housing. The first one is what I call supported accommodation, which includes that SDA group I was talking about before, but it extends on it. And the other one is what I call supported community living. This makes more sense when you see the examples. So I was talking about supported accommodation. I said the SDA, the NDIS funded part of it, is a key part of that supported accommodation. And that has two parts, existing and new. And while we have no existing here, across the country we have about 17,500 places of existing SDA, and we're going to grow that to 28,000. So when I look at Victoria, for example, we've probably got 70 or 80% of the SDA we're going to have. We might redevelop the existing stuff, but the existing is very important. There is also other options emerging which are intriguing me, and they are what are sometimes called SIL houses. SIL is the support component of where people live in SDA houses. So there's the housing part of it is SDA, the support part of it is SIL. Where people are not getting housing funding from the NDIS, support providers are aggregating them together because there's efficiencies about bringing people together. And there is so much money in the support side that it actually creates a business case to allow this to happen. Whether this is good or bad, I'm not sure, but this is just what's happening out there in the marketplace. We're seeing the emergence of these SIL houses. And we also have the old supported residential services, SRSs. Now, you wouldn't have any of these, I wouldn't think, here, but okay. So once again, you can cross out some of these options for your community, so the diagram gets simpler. Then we move into supported community living, and I talk about social and affordable housing. We were talking briefly before about Haven Home Safe, and I'll go into the money that was announced in social housing before, but it's worth just distinguishing. There's different forms of social housing, just to get the terminology right. There's public housing, which is the government-run stuff. There's community housing, and there's this very strange beast, which is affordable housing, which is typically run by community housing, but it has a different target group. It comes out of England. It was about key workers in England, and essentially it puts properties on the market at about 75% of market rental. So it's government subsidised, but it's not that 25% of or 30% of income we see in social housing. It's for those people on low wages. Now, for most NDIS participants, that 75% market would rule them out. They wouldn't be able to afford that. However, what we're seeing is some flexibility in some of the funding programs that might allow us to bridge that gap. So in the past I would have ruled that out, but I'm saying there's a possibility there. So when Haven Home Safe talked about building some units of affordable housing in this town or nearby, you might think, well, maybe some of that could work into this program. It provides possibility. Then, of course, there's private rental. Now, in most communities, in most places around the country, a person with disability living on the DSP cannot afford to rent a flat, a one-bedroom flat by themselves, and still have enough money to survive. So they really need to share, and that can be problematic, obviously. Sometimes it's difficult for people with disability to share. So you're caught a bit in this equation between you can't live with somebody but you can't afford the rent on your own. Once again, the ILO program might provide us some bridge for those people who need to share. Not expensive to rent.
Very expensive, yeah.
And there's not much rental around.
Exceptionally expensive. It's dearer here than in Bendigo.
Yeah, so this makes sense to you. So in terms of housing, I know I'm painting a very complicated picture, but when you take it back to your community, you should recognise this as either being here or not. So this should make sense. One of the things I was really interested in is thinking about how do people end up in a particular space. So, like, I've talked about these different options, but let's think about this idea of gateways. And the first thing that happens is that people with disabilities might end up in supported accommodation. And this looks complicated, but essentially it's a flowchart that says if you need a high level of support, then you pass through the green gateway and you're into the level of supported accommodation. If you're eligible for SDA, then you go into SDA, and if the SDA is available, you then go into new or existing SDA. So it's a pathway. And when we take it down through this community here, what you see is there's statistically, there should be people in this community that are eligible for SDA. They're not living here, but they should be here. Not exactly sure why.
Well, they've gone.
They've gone.
Earlier on, when group homes were in other places, they had to go to other towns. That's actually happened.
And what's happened in this journey is they qualified for, they had a high significant level of support need, they qualified for SDA, but the supply wasn't here. What's different today is there is a funding, a commercially available funding that will allow SDA to build. So this is your opportunity to bring those people home, which is really important. And this is what the NDIS offers. With all its complexity and everything else, this is the great opportunity, I think. And if they're not eligible for SDA, there still might be a way that you can bring them together in some form that use the economies of scale around the support, because these people might have funding of $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 a year. There's a lot of money available in funding. So if you can generate some support, efficiencies, you might be able to use that to fund the housing, for example, and once again bring them home or keep them in this community. Now, if they, the next question, strangely, is around financial capacity. So, you know, if people don't have a high level of support need, my next question, it sounds brutal, and housing is brutal. You know, do they have some financial capacity? And the answer is no. Well, they then fall into the whole social housing stream, hopefully. Now, there's very little or no social housing in this town.
No.
Okay.
A little bit, I think, just a few little bits in there.
We might see some more coming on, but if they don't get into social housing, this might push them into the private rental market, which will be unaffordable, but it's probably their best option. It's a bad option, but their best bad option, if you like. If they do have some financial capacity, and they've got, I called it much, this is sort of very crude, but you know, home ownership in some ways is the best option for people who can afford it. You know, because you just bypass all of the complexity of everything else, and the barriers to home ownership, and particularly family-funded developments in the past, has been the lack of support. There's been money around in family-funded projects for many years, but they often haven't worked because of support. But this is what the NDIS allows us to do. We can actually make these projects work, and it was that project we were briefly talking about before, where people were contributing a couple of $100,000.
Yes.
You could see how it could work. If they have some capacity, it might be that they can simply just rent on the private market and their family could subsidise them to live by themselves. That could work. Or somebody could subsidise, and it might be their own funds. There are mixed and shared equity schemes. There's not many of these around at the minute. They have, at various times, various ones have rolled out, but I'm not aware of any actually open at the minute. Or there might be this affordable housing supply, which I am quite optimistic about. I think there's a real chance there could be an opportunity here, so I'd keep an eye on that. And so you do end up working down through that sort of process when you think about people. So you go through the gateways, and within a 5-minute discussion of people with somebody, you can figure out where they're going to end up, really. And then that also shows up what's not in your community.
Yes.